Alright guys, we are gonna make history today. How did Shirou turn into the Emiya Alter that we know from FGO lore? Recently we did a video covering the controversial topics that are in Fate Stay Night and Fate Zero, and one of the comments that stood out was one regarding the relationship between Sakura and Shirou, and it went into a lot of detail, mostly just covering the main meat and potatoes of what Heaven's Feel is in general, the differences between the true and the normal ending, and what the route means in comparison to the others in the story. Fate, UB-Dub, everything is real linear. There's really no deviations to be made because the ideals that Shirou carries require him to be in this mental state where he's constantly lying to himself. It's the only thing proper that can help him with his past. But with the introduction of Heaven's Feel, all of that goes out the window. Things get real. He can't put on the facade anymore. He has to deal with the situation. And the reason that I bring all this up, and I wasn't gonna cover this at first, but I had made a post a while back concerning the decision of him taking Sakura's life. Now the comment that I mentioned before, what I liked about it was the fact that it brought up the true and the normal endings. Now when I first came into the fandom, I was partial to the normal ending because of the realism. My thought process behind that was it really brought together the entire route where you had everything start to change, and so the ending result changed along with it. It was just a perfect way to end the story. In that story, at least, the story of Heaven's Feel. They were like, no, you're looking at it wrong. You have to think about it collectively. You can't just think about it as the end of Heaven's Feel. You gotta look at it like it's the end of Fate Stay Night in general. Is that really the most appropriate ending for all the things that Shirou and the rest of the characters have been through? And at the time I said, you know what, that's a good point. And for a long time I had changed my opinion on that. But what this guy pointed out in my newest video is that the normal ending acts as a sort of atonement for Sakura, and she kind of has to answer to some of those evils that she took part in and said that she enjoyed out of her own mouth multiple times, whether people want to ignore it or not. And so it had me looking back at the scene in particular, and I had to ask, what if he really did go through with it? And the more I looked at Shirou, the more I started to see something familiar. His father. I saw Kiritsugu. I saw Kiritsugu standing in the workshop with the gun in his hand after taking out his own father. Exact same scenario. It's like, man, it's crazy how I've never thought of that circumstance side by side. And you gotta think, Shirou is practically grown. So you can just imagine what Kiritsugu was going through, who was several years younger than him and had to deal with the exact same situation. And he decided to go through with it. And you know what happened? It scarred him for life. It changed the design, the way that his brain functioned for life, because Kiritsugu was not like that. You see how he interacted with the people in the town, how he interacted with Shirley. So you can also imagine what happens if Shirou goes through with the situation as well. There's a scene from the movies that features Mind of Steel Shirou. This is a version of Shirou from one of the bad ends that goes down the Kiritsugu route. He goes down the practical route, where he vows to defeat everybody in the war. Ilya, Zoken, Rin, doesn't matter. You got people like Ilya being disappointed and people like Kirei being excited that he caved in. And there's a few scenes in the second movie, Lost Butterfly, that entertains him going down this route. And it's depicting Shirou and Sakura standing on the fiery hill, but instead of it being about his past, it's more so catered towards his future. And in the flashback, you'll see Emiya and Kiritsugu pass by him and they just completely ignore his existence. Almost to say that if you walk down this path, you have to realize what you'll be throwing away. You'd be throwing away exactly what makes you Shirou Emiya. And I don't mean just throwing away the ideal of saving everybody in comparison to just saving Sakura. I mean the idea of the method is and the directions that you use to get to that point, you'll see Shirou standing at the top of the hill with the sword to Sakura's throat. And I feel like this very scene kind of gives us the groundwork for what could have been a path that led down to Emiya Alter. Because remember, Emiya Alter isn't necessarily pure evil either. He just went down a path where he lost himself, and so he just continued to do the unrighteous. He more so started to align himself with that Kiritsugu mindset. So the same way Kiritsugu had to deal with his situation when he was a child, if Shirou gets rid of Sakura, then he becomes the very enemy that he tried to avoid. He would become the antagonist of the Heaven's Field route himself, literally. And so he eliminates Sakura, and worse than Kiritsugu, he can no longer stand himself, but he's also too deep in to turn back. So what does he do? He throws away that former identity and changes it over for the Emiya Alter we see now. He goes on his campaigns, he finds out about people like Kiara, for example, and the cult that she had, and he ends up getting in that situation. And the same thing that he was dealing with before, where he had to make that decision, am I really going to go through with it? And then the people under Kiara started to throw themselves at Shirou. This is what led him to giving up and letting go. So he takes all of these people down, takes their lives just for him to get to Kiara, to fulfill his wish of hunting her down, because she was also something that needed to be eliminated. She was the scab that needed to be cut off. He gets through all these people, and then she takes her own life. So now technically Shirou has taken the lives of all these people for no reason. It's almost like she canceled out everything that he had worked for. It was the worst outcome possible. And so given that dire situation, he had to continue erasing his identity. And if you notice, in that scene, he had yet to cut his hair. The act of cutting your hair, and in Japan specifically, is symbolic to a cleansing. You're trying to cleanse yourself of your impurities. And so while hoping to stay true to himself, he ended up chopping off his hair, and that's something that we know Shirou is known to do. If you remember my video covering Nameless and why he grew his hair out, he said it was time for a change. And though it was never said outright, I can guarantee that it was more so to address his evolution into Extella, because as a spirit in that timeline, he's far ascended what he was capable of in the regular Stay Night timeline. And so in the same way, Shirou cuts his hair, more so as an act of regression. He changes his attire to match his background. He finally starts to adopt the guns that he's always been interested in, because in that video I've also mentioned that Emi is fascinated with guns, but they were never his go-to weapon because of efficiency. But now that he's remolding himself as Emiya Alter, that's completely off of the table. He starts to take Kansho and Bakia and bend them into actual guns themselves. That way he's not reminded of who he once was, but still keeping the core of what Shirou is meant to stand for. Look at his skin, and he ended up getting censored over here in NA, but his original form is a lot darker than it would appear normally. Now when you first look at it, the easy thing to suggest would be that Shirou was so stressed out that he actually turned into a black man himself. But jokes aside, this is no black man. He's still Japanese, he just appears this way. The reality of the matter is, his skin is the result of the same issues that he suffered before, overloading himself with his own magecraft to the point where he flat out burned his pigmentation. But this time around, he does it even more so than he did before. There's an interesting thread on the FGO Reddit, and I'll throw the link down below, where there's a conversation talking about his actual appearance. The gold that you see permeating throughout his body is actually a reference to Kintsugi, a Japanese art where you fix pottery by piecing it together with substances like gold. And as you can see with Emiya, they look exactly the same. And it gets even deeper than that when you realize that Kintsugi, conceptually, the art stands for not hiding your flaws, but more so wearing it as a badge of honor, which we can definitely see with Emiya. So it's not just his mental being held together. The Kintsugi design itself is almost like Emiya physically being held together so he doesn't fall apart. The way that he styled his hair, this isn't a coincidence. Who usually has a low shaved head? Monks, right? priests. So the very act of Shirou shaving his head can also be seen as a tribute to all the people that he took down under Kiara, because remember, Kiara and her people were from a Buddhist sect. That way, those same people will always be with him. And to double down on this, there was a recent release in the manga where we get more into the background of Emiya Alter, back when he was in Seraph and he was having flashbacks on who he was. You have the point where he invaded the temple to get to Kiara, and it actually shows those same followers that was mentioned before, and you can see her in the middle with them all around her. And Emiya is just straight up blasting through these monks. Initially, they weren't even fighting him back. They didn't know he was there, and he's just taking them all out mercilessly. And you'll notice that he's not opting to the dual guns that he usually has. He has a sword in one hand and he has a gun in the other, and he's wearing this black trench coat. It had gotten so bad that the monks started blasting back at him. Like, this is crazy. And Shirou just continued to take them down regardless. But what we later come to find in that same chapter is that the reason that he has the sword and the gun is because that it represents that this is a transitional phase. This is right before he completely became nameless in the extra timelines. And when he takes his hood off, you can see that he looks exactly the same. He's got the all black on, his chest is covered up this time around, he's got the red scarf. If you remember his flashback in extra, the same one that he had before. And I gotta give it to the artist, the design work is exceptional. It really gets me excited to get into things like this because it reminds me of when we did the analysis of Shirou years back, and we were talking about Kansho and Bakia and how the wife threw herself into the furnace. Every piece of Emiya Alter's design is alluding to his sacrifice. Even if you go into his Noble Phantasm, Unlimited Lost Works, and how the coloring of the swords is inverted and they erupt from the inside of his target instead of him shooting the actual weapons at them. It's meant to identify with all the things that he's lost. The bands on his wrists, that when you look at them, they look more like shackles to represent confinement, that he'll always feel trapped this way. And then there's another creative choice. If you haven't seen, there's a tattoo of IV directly on his back. And with me having IV in my name myself, I can tell you that this is not just for show. But in his case, it means something different. For in Japanese is literally written as the word death. So this is something that embodies him as well. And every time he walks away, you can get his whole story just by looking at this one tattoo. And that just goes right back into the Kintsugi idea where you're bearing all your flaws for judgment. It's likely the reason that he has his shirt open now in the first place. He wants you to see it because initially Stay Night Emiya always had this covered up. Even Ataraxia Emiya would at the very least wear his chest guard. Something else that I noticed in his transitions was his ascension art. You'll see that his guns start to come together to form a new armament, an actual dual-sided blade that he keeps in his second stage. He doesn't change again when he goes to his third form. And then there's Emiya Alter's relationship with Sakura that really makes everything come full circle, and that will be his appearance at the end of the CCC chapter, back when he saved Melt. This scene alone can be looked at as a poetic factor. For everything Emiya Alter had done in his past, it still led him to being the one that saved Sakura. Because again, Melt is part of the Sakura 5, created by BB, and BB is just a counterpart to Sakura. So he still saved Sakura anyway. And you could argue that saving her, it really feels like a quantum time lock. Like that event just has to happen. Because him doing this is really what made or broke the chapter. Because if he didn't, then Kiara would have repurposed again, and then we would have had a whole nother problem. And if you remember, Emiya was in a fatal position, which means that it was his dying wish that he had to pull this off or it wouldn't sit right with him. And that's the way that he carries out of the story. There's really more to it than you know.